Cold Case Talk. Together we take unsolved homicides and disappearances one step further.
Welcome to Cold Case Talk. I'm Kara Porter, one of the co-founders of the Cold Case Coalition.
And I'm Tom Harvey, another co-founder. This is episode 2. Joe Santi was a wealthy Utah businessman, but one morning in January of 1977, he failed to show up for a breakfast date. Jewelry and coins in his apartment were mostly untouched, but there were tiny drops of blood found and, mysteriously, a pillowcase was left with valuables inside. What happened to Joe Santi? So one day he just disappears, and you can imagine with somebody that prominent, with all those businesses, money coming in, money going out, that type of thing, that a number of both rumors, speculation, and theories would follow that disappearance.
Well, and I think those rumors are part of the reason why this case was closed after exactly 5 months. And I think it's why, and people just made assumptions because of what was reported in the media. And even the police made some assumptions because they were told certain things that actually just were flat out not true. If you read the news accounts after Joe Santi goes missing, then you think you know what happened to Joe Santi, right? You think, oh, he's in financial straits. Oh my goodness, he embezzled almost $300,000 from the Royal Inns of America. Oh my gosh, people were suing him. He had every reason to leave. His marriage was troubled, and that wasn't really publicized as much. But the police certainly believe that that was part of the problem. And then, of course, we heard what sounded very damning, which was Joe went missing the day before he was scheduled to testify against his brother in a federal criminal case in California. That's what people thought. That's what the police thought. That's what the family thought. It's absolutely what the media thought. It's also what some occasional, like local news persons or a podcast, that's what they thought. And it's also what the life insurance company thought. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But I think it's safe to say, Tom, that by the time we were done with our investigation, all of that turned out to be wrong.
No, in the record after, our really extensive investigation into this case and all of the documents that we gathered from various places, not just police reports, but archives and other places, court records, and all of that, none of that turned out to be true.
All wrong. Every fact that they were relying on to suggest that Joe Santi voluntarily went missing, all wrong. And that's what we're going to talk about next. By the way, I should say that one advantage we have in this case is that we have dozens of statements, handwritten or transcribed from recordings that people made in the 1980s about Joseph Santi. And they made these statements in the context of a life insurance dispute. After a person has gone missing a certain number of years, you can apply for a death certificate. There's a presumption of death. And the insurance company said, okay, you can presume that Joe Santi is dead if you want to, but that doesn't mean that he was murdered. You may have heard the phrase double indemnity, but the family would get twice as much life insurance if he were killed than if he simply was presumed dead. And so it basically became a very bitter fight between the Santi family and the life insurance company.
And kind of as a result of that, that's why we got a lot of the kind of firsthand accounts of what people believed happened, assets, all of those types of things.
One of the things that we do in almost all of our cases is we go down just to see if a local archives or special collection might have something. And so, for example, we wanted to know about Joe's finances. We wanted to know about his brother's trial, about his wife and whether they were getting divorced, et cetera. So we spent quite a bit of time gathering all that information. I'm not faulting the police, but there's a well-known doctrine called the right to go missing. And the police had been given information that was just wrong, that made them think this guy's gone, he's out of the country, etc. They didn't actually even keep the photos or the video that they took of the apartment, for example. They didn't keep any of the evidence, like the little blood on the newspaper or any of that stuff, because this was just a missing persons case and they had no reason to think there was a crime. Okay, so flash forward, it's now the mid 1980s, and the Santi family is claiming life insurance benefits, and the insurance company is saying, no way. So let's talk about what the insurance company claimed and what we found out was actually the truth. They started by saying, well, we think he took off because he was going to have to testify against his brother in California the next day. You remember reading all of that, those statements over and over again?
Oh, sure. And of course, the thought was that he wasn't going to testify against his own brother in this case, which, maybe he thought it would implicate him in something, and so he just took off.
Now, there was a criminal case being pursued by the federal government against Albert Santi at the time. It was in California, and it involved kind of like a penny stock, where there was an allegation that a Utah printer had printed basically some fake stock certificates. And Albert Santi and a couple of others were alleged to have all agreed to fly to Miami and then do some business relating to these forged stock certificates. But instead, they were arrested when they got there. So then the cases were split up, because you can't just bring federal actions in particular jurisdictions. So Albert Santi's ended up in California. And Tom actually used to cover the courts for the Salt Lake Tribune for many years.
Well, court records are just tremendous sources of information about all kinds of things. So they're really useful for somebody, either a reporter or somebody doing a podcast about an old case.
Yeah, so the issue here was, could we get information that far back on a crime that, to be honest, wasn't really all that serious?
And whether would that show that was true, that Joe Santi may have run off to avoid testifying?
Yeah, well, I mean, the timing of it sounds pretty damning, right?
Yeah.
Why else is he taking off when he has just a routine doctor's appointment that he made for a few days later? There's something about the timing. So the federal courts, I have to say, I give them a shout out. Our local federal court in Salt Lake City and the federal court in San Francisco. These things are not on computers. We're talking having to go through and look at the little hand cards, because some of the information was not there. And I was like, I know it's got to be there. And they came through. They really did. Utah was able to find in the cards the trial information once the case was ultimately moved to Utah. And in San Francisco, the records clerk there was able to go back to the 70s and find the actual information about the upcoming trial in Albert Stanti's uh, in his case.
So
And
was it the day was it the day after, I think, that was the
yeah,
trial the day after Joseph Santi supposedly disappeared? Or Joseph Santi disappeared? That's not a very good question.
no, I get what you're saying. So there was an upcoming trial in San Francisco. So that part was true. However, one of the things that the court in San Francisco was able to find for us was the actual witness list. Um, the parties were required to identify each person who might testify in the case, particularly the government, because it's their burden of proof. And also, they found the old subpoenas. I mean, it was amazing. Um, Joseph Santi was not a witness. He was not subpoenaed. He was never going to be asked to testify in Albert's case. That was very clear from the San Francisco record. Ultimately, by the way, the trial did not even happen. The case got bumped to Utah. But strike one, he was not scheduled to testify against his brother then or ever. And it was frankly, it was a pretty mild case. If I remember correctly, I think Albert was either found guilty by a Utah jury or he pled guilty. And I think he only served like a year and a half, something like that. So,
So that's not a reason that for the disappearance of Joe Santi.
no. And ironically, it's stated as fact throughout the police records. But I think nobody actually just ever bothered to check, and it wasn't true. So the next argument that the insurance company made was to say that Joe probably ran off because Mary had tried to kill him, among other things. And so we had to look into that. Right? He had a terrible marriage, said, and he needed to get away from her. So we tracked down that information. And it's true that 1975, right, this is a year and a half before Joe goes missing, Joe filed for divorce against Mary. And there's a witness statement in one of the files that says it followed a big screaming match, basically, between the two of them. So he files his for divorce in July of 1975. So what we needed to know was what actually happened in that divorce case. Because Mary said, yeah, he filed. And then at one point she filed. And then she said, and then we just decided to let it go. Okay, so it was undisputed. Joe had filed for divorce in 75 and had made a lot of accusations against Mary. Of course, one thing you have to remember, Tom, do you remember the old days? You used to have to come up with reasons. Remember that?
Yeah, you had to have explicit reasons about bad things in the marriage, abuse, that type of thing, in order to be granted a divorce.
Right. So there was no such thing as no fault divorce at the time. You had to say mental or physical cruelty or words to that effect. So there was some pretty harsh language that the life insurance company was throwing at the Santi family as one reason they weren't going to pay the insurance. So we needed to investigate that. Was the marriage really in that big of trouble? Did Mary really try to kill Joe? And so we started working on that. And we actually found some really good information at the state archives.
Hi, Heidi Stringham, Research Center Manager for the archives. Generally, we have court records that are older than 50 years. There are a few counties that there are exceptions to that, some like older ones that we don't have, and then some we have up to about 1983, 84. just depending on the county. But Salt Lake County, which is your focus today, it is a pretty hard and fast 50 years.
So as Heidi points out, this file normally would not have even been at the state archives, but yay, there it was. We also got some old police records about a prior incident where there had been a shooting at their house. So how would you summarize the violence accusations, Tom, that the life insurance company was making against Mary?
Well, I think what they were trying to say, I think, was that I don't know if they would have gone this far, but they were trying to say that Joe may have taken off because of Mary's violence toward him, type of thing, or abuse, and the marriage was falling apart, and there had been incidents of violence, which there had been in it, and so who knows what happened to Joe Santi. As part of the lawsuit, attorneys for the insurance company questioned Mary about the domestic violence allegations. Here are readers recreating those moments as they appear on transcripts.
Did you ever attack Joe physically?
No.
Ever shoot him?
No.
You never shot him?
No.
Ever stabbed him?
No. As I said before, the only trouble my husband and I ever had was Royal Inns of America. That's when he hit me because I wouldn't leave the hotel.
How many times did he hit you?
A couple.
There was a prior police record where Mary had fired a gun, but it was not at Joe. He was not even on, it was actually in her bedroom, and he was in a completely different part of the house. Joe said that she was really angry with him, and then she even pointed the gun at him at some point during that encounter, and it did get physical. Mary acknowledged there had been some physical, he had hit her on that instance.
He used to have a pistol around the house quite often, and that's the pistol that was discharged. But I didn't know it was loaded, and I went to pick it up, and I said, "What's this doing here? Getting upset with guns, pistols, and all this baloney." And the darn thing went through the top of the window.
We did not find any confirmation of any other serious accusation of violence, though, in any of the records or the police reports.
Right, that seems to have been the only time, and if I remember correctly, it goes back to the Royal Inn and the couple's dispute over how to deal with the management of the corporation.
Well, I really think that Mary was onto something when she said everything could be tied back to the Royal Inns, because in 1975 he had filed for divorce. But interestingly, there was never a response. A year had gone by with no answer, no counterclaim, no activity whatsoever. And that's not normal if you are seriously moving forward with a divorce.
It indicates
right?
that they had backed off and weren't pressing their attorneys to continue with the divorce.
Exactly. But then something happened. In 1976, and who knows exactly why he did it, but Joe decided to basically let Royal Inns take back the hotel. And so how Mary described it was Joe, he threw it into liquidation, which basically it just meant I'm giving it back to Royal Inns. They'll sell it and we'll see what we have. Mary was very upset. She had poured her heart and soul into that hotel. She worked there. It was a passion for her. And when she found out about that, she decided, okay, I've had enough of this. And so she then went ahead and answered that year-old divorce complaint. And she put a bunch of, of those accusations in too. So as of the summer of 1976, it looked as though there was a hot and heavy divorce going on between these two. I mean, just 6 months before he goes missing, I can sort of understand why the insurance company found that interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But luckily, we were able to confirm something important that Mary said. She said, "Yeah, I was angry and I went ahead and responded, but then they just shelved it again." Um, she was angry. She had filed her paperwork. She had asked for a trial date, but then they never went through with it. And you and I both thought that was extremely important that we confirm that, right? Made a huge difference.
Right, right. It did, it really did, because, another reason gone for why Joe might have disappeared. And it was pretty clear that while they had been in divorce court and stuff, that they had both backed off and they weren't going through with the divorce.
Yes, and then we found the actual golden nugget again at our state archives. And in there was a confirmation by the court that Joe had not done what needed to be done if they wanted to have a trial date, that no trial was going to occur unless the parties took certain steps, and nothing was ever done. So it was exactly as Mary was saying, which is they got hot-headed, they had some unfortunate encounters, but neither of them appeared to be moving forward with the divorce. I mean, they had separated after that big fight. There was a big fight in early 1976 with the gun that was discharged. After that, Mary had started staying more in Price, but that was it. So we felt like that pretty much wiped out that whole argument that, they were in the midst of a brutal divorce and all that. So that left the next argument that the insurance company made. And that was really their biggest argument, don't you think?
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And one that was repeated, in the news media and by the police and stuff like that before the divorce or the insurance case ever happened.
For sure. What was reported constantly was that Joe was financially desperate, and even more than that, the Royal Inns, okay, the very people that Mary did not trust, they were affirmatively asserting that Joe and Mary had embezzled almost $300,000. Well, that sounded terrible, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that is mentioned repeatedly in the police file as well.
And he was facing several lawsuits, over this and that and stuff. And so you had this theory built up, rumors and such, that he was just in big financial trouble. He had run off with a bunch of money. He was owed a bunch of money to people. He was being sued. So he just ran off to avoid all of that.
It really made a compelling story. And if all you did was read the local media, you thought Joe Santi had embezzled almost $300,000 and had taken off. So we had to research that. And we actually found quite a bit of documentation about Joe's true financial condition. Okay, first of all, was Joe being sued? Yes. Had he been sued his entire adult life in one way or the other? Yes.
Yes.
Maybe it's just me being the cynical lawyer, but I've got clients that actually even like being sued. But businessmen get, unless you're mousy and thus not a good business person, you're in lawsuits, litigation constantly. He had been sued from day one when he was handing out free tickets to senior citizens. So we didn't see any lawsuit you covered the courts for years. I am a lawyer for 35 years. We studied all of the lawsuits against him and saw nothing that would appear to bother Joe Santi. Is that a fair
Nothing that
statement?
nothing that was threatening his business empire, nothing that would take him down and send him into bankruptcy court or something like that. Nothing where anybody was going to win a big judgment against him.
Exactly. And so then they'd say, well, he had cash flow problems. And you know what? He did, right? We found that. But the reason he had cash flow problems was because Joe was always on to the next deal, right? So, for example, he would, at the time he disappeared, I've got a couple of notes on this. He had bought a sevenplex in Salt Lake City, and he had just bought a house in Ogden, and he was in the process of fixing those up and flipping those. So he always had cash flow issues. But we didn't see anything. When we went through his finances, we did not see anything that was different from just the way he had conducted his whole business career, which is he's one step ahead of the creditors, then he pays them off, and then he's on to his next venture.
He has periods where he has lots of cash and money, and he has other periods where he's out in the desert with looking for money underneath rocks.
Yeah, nothing weird there. And I think one thing that's probably I think one thing that kind of answers the whole question, after Joe disappeared, at one point there was a court-appointed receiver who went through all of his assets. And that receiver, who, by the way, he actually threw the estate into bankruptcy. And like he said, I just needed to stop like foreclosures and things like that were going to happen because Joe had disappeared. So this is the guy who knew the finances.
Essentially, all of the existing obligations of Joe Santi could be satisfied by the sale of this property. The custodian currently has in his possession several offers for the purchase of the property. The highest and most recent offer is for $825,000 gross.
And that happened to be the Villa Granada Apartments where Joe lived. That alone wiped out all of his debt. So again, we didn't see the financial angle. So what about this embezzlement? I mean, that sounded bad. Did Joe embezzle $278,000 from the Royal Inns of America? And what did we conclude on that one?
Well, the Royal Inns themselves went into bankruptcy at that point, and one of the results was that they ended up owing the Santis, I think it was around that same number. It was over $200,000. So they didn't embezzle $278,000. They were actually owed several $100,000 by the Royal Inns.
Yeah, I mean, at one point, all of the owners in the country got together and filed a class action against Royal Inns. So that whole thing about Joe Santi embezzling almost $300,000, frankly, was just, I mean, I know the lawyer who made the statement, and he was just getting ahead of it. He was advocating for his client. And also, the reason that he was taking that position was because, remember when Joe had thrown the hotel, the Royal Inn, into liquidation? So what that meant was they were going to find a buyer for it. And then Joe and Mary would be entitled to some of that money because they still had their investment money in there. So Royal Inns was just trying to get ahead of it by saying, we're going to sell this to a buyer. Don't give Joe and Mary anything, or at least offset it. But in a nutshell, Joe and Mary had not embezzled anything. They knew it, and Royal Inns knew it. And again, no reason to think that Joe Santi would have taken off for anything to do with that.
So what we're at here is the things that were rumors and showed up in police reports about why this prominent businessman may have disappeared. All of them, that we mentioned up to this point turned out not to be true. There was just no factual basis to conclude that he would have run off because for any of these reasons.
Remember the dispute about the life insurance claim? It actually went to trial, and it went to trial in front of Judge Bruce Jenkins, a federal district court judge. And Judge Jenkins listened to all the evidence from both sides, the insurance company and the Santi family, and he made a decision about what happened to Joe Santi. And I have to say, this is an honor for us that he agreed to read those portions of his ruling.
Okay, I've been asked to deal with a case that we decided, 33 years ago, but which started more than 35 years ago. And I'm happy to do that. It's Santi versus the Prudential Insurance Company of America. It was civil number 84-202. Pertinent paragraphs they've asked for are paragraphs 8 and 9. And I'm happy to read those. Mr. Santi, this was an effort on the part of his wife, surviving wife, in reference to some insurance claims. But in paragraph 8, it says, Mr. Santi was best described as a wheeler-dealer. He accumulated a sizable estate by buying things and selling them at a profit. He would buy almost anything on which he felt he could make a profit, from coins to real estate. He owned a considerable amount of real estate in both Salt Lake and Carbon counties. Mr. Santi was a man possessed by his possession. He owned 2 Cadillacs and a Ford pickup, valuable collections of guns and coins, I should say, antique furniture, gold and jewelry. He was very proud of his possessions. He was not overly concerned about the origin of some of the personal property he acquired. And his business associates were not always above reproach. They've asked me to read paragraph 18, having to do with his disappearance. In the short paragraph just above 18, we conclude in saying, in short, there is evidence that Mr. Santi had good reason to disappear voluntarily. And then in paragraph 18, although Mr. Santi had cause to disappear voluntarily, in balance, other facts persuade the court that he did not do so. Rather, the court finds that, considering all the evidence, it is more likely than not that Mr. Santi was killed on or about January 23, 1977. Among other factors compelling that conclusion are the suddenness with which he left his possessions, the suspicious nature of the transaction he was engaged in immediately before his disappearance, the relative order of automobiles and personal property, his clothing, furniture, and personal articles were undisturbed, the open apartment, the absence of money, the trace of blood, and the articles in the pillowcases. His possessive, almost miserly nature militate against voluntary departure. He was simply not the type of person who would walk away from his possessions voluntarily. Rather, all of this evidence weighs heavily in favor of involuntary departure or death. There is no sign of premeditated disappearance. Indeed, Mr. Santi has told others he was planning to go to Ogden the day he disappeared to see the house on which he was working. Although Mr. Santi was under several clouds at the time of his disappearance, it is likely that he would have weathered the storm. Despite the litigation pending at the time of his disappearance, when Mr. Santi's estate was finally settled, its net value in the hundreds of thousands, its net value, I should say, was in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And paragraph 19 could be helpful, I think. The parties agree that if Mr. Santi was killed, his death resulted directly and independently of all of the other causes.
So what happened to Joe Santi? Stay tuned for episode 3.
If you have information about this or any other unsolved homicide or missing person case, now is the time to speak up. You can contact us on our website at coldcasetalk.com or call the Cold Case Coalition's confidential tip line at 385-CLUE-313. That's 385-258-3313. Let us know what you think of the show on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Cold Case Talk. By subscribing, rating, reviewing, and sharing this podcast with others, you help us keep these cases in the light.